Hey there. One hot topic as it relates to the 3C is what is the battery life? And, is the battery life good or is it bad? And I've seen reviews and posts on social media that have staked claims in both camps. One saying that the battery life isn't particularly good, and the other saying actually it's quite good. And so what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show how actually those are not mutually exclusive opinions. Those opinions can both exist. And the reason why is it's heavily dependent on how the device is being used. And there are some activities which lend itself to longevity as it relates to battery life, and there's other activities that tend to make battery life fairly skimpy. So we'll walk through what those factors are, and then I'll give my overall assessment of how I kind of feel about the battery life. So let me make a couple observations before we get into the data. First off, I did about 12 hours of battery observations under various conditions with the device in order to try to kind of isolate the various factors and what have you. That's a good number of observations. It's by no means extensive, though. And there's a little bit of an approximation as it relates to the measurement of these observations. So I'm using the battery indicator on the device itself, which only goes in 1% increments. So generally, I try to basically wait for that counter to go down, then begin my test, and then conclude the test when the counter turns again. That keeps that fairly accurate. But some of my observations were more time-based, and they didn't necessarily follow that tight of a criteria. So the result of that is that the observations are generally accurate. And even though I'm using, fractions in some of these cases, just keep that in mind. It's really kind of a rule of thumb. Your experience may vary. In addition to that, there's a few factors that I didn't really attempt to isolate that could potentially have impacted battery. And I think these things will generally be kind of embedded in the selection of application drain. So things like, is the GPU of the device a battery drain? There's a lot of folks that say yes, and there's some folks that say no, and I actually don't know the answer to that. I don't have a way to tease that out. So I can't tell you whether the presence of a GPU is increasing battery drain or not. Remember that battery drain is actually a combination of two factors. It's not only how much energy is being used, but it's also reflective of the size of the battery. So all these measurements are really specific to this particular device. And in order to kind of tease out the GPU element, I would have to find a comparable device without a GPU to try to kind of isolate that. And I just didn't bother to do that in this particular instance. In a similar fashion, I didn't take much account of refresh rates. Now, I did some battery testing before with the Tab Mini C, and we did look at refresh rates in that time. And while there was an impact, it was not nearly the size of the impact of other factors, and so generally I didn't consider them to be particularly important. What I will say, though, is that there's no question that the more the screen refreshes, the more energy is being used. I mean, that's just the underlying technology that's involved. And some refresh rates do lend themselves to more flashes of that screen. HD is a good example of that. But you can also make settings where you can actually click the number of refreshes by clicks or by pages and what have you. I left all those things at default and didn't tease them out. But just know that there are those things that you can use either to try to lessen the battery drain or to increase it, particularly if you are refreshing at a higher frequency than the default is. All right, so with all that kind of geeky stuff out of the way, let's go in and take a look at what my observations revealed and what the implications of that are. Okay, let's look at the details of my observations and see what it tells us about the battery life of the 3C. So we're going to start looking at connectivity. And by the way, all the percentages that you're going to see is basically what the percentage drain is per hour on the device. So starting with Wi-Fi, if Wi-Fi is on, not actively engaged, but it is pinging based on the apps on the device for updates and what have you, then you're talking about a 2% battery drain per hour with that on. If you're talking about Bluetooth, and this is Bluetooth on but not connected to a device, and obviously once connected to the device, it will depend on the type of device, etc. But without that, it's about 0.7% of drain. So that represents the connectivity drain that you can experience on the device. Another major area for battery drain is front lighting. And interestingly enough, half of cold lighting drains about 1% per hour, but full for cold lighting drains 6% per hour. Now this seems a little odd at first glance because you think that it would be linear, that half would be, maybe say roughly 3 or 4% battery drain, not 1%. But if you actually see front lighting on the device, you can tell that half lighting is not half the brightness of full lighting. It's not linear at all. So these percentages do actually make sense when you look at the device. The next major category for battery drainage is on applications. So we'll start with Flipster. So this is a magazine app. It's draining about 3.2% per hour, and that kind of makes sense. It's mostly reading, but there is some refreshes of pages as you're flipping from page to page. But for the most part, you're zooming in on columns and reading text. So you're not refreshing the screen as much as you are with some other applications. And so that battery drain does make sense overall. Google News is at 13%, much higher than Flipster, for example. And this makes sense too. You're doing a lot of scrolling. You're going into articles. Sometimes those articles have pop-up ads. So there's a lot of things happening on the screen. So it's very intensive. And so it does make sense that it drains the battery by a significant degree. Using the Kindle, we're looking at comics, and in particular, we're going cell by cell in the comics. And with that, it's 4.3%. It makes sense that that would drain more than just reading a novel because you're refreshing the screen at a much quicker rate because it's easier to read a cell and then move on to the next cell. But it's not as intensive as some other applications that's constantly refreshing the screen. So speaking of novels, I use Kobo, and this is a bit of a rough estimate, and it might actually not be quite as bad as this, but it's only 0.9% battery drain, very low drain, the lowest we'll see in all applications, and it's simply because you're refreshing the screen at much smaller intervals, and you've got no video or audio, so it's pretty light in terms of its intensive use of the battery. This one you're going to have to take with a grain of salt. So note-taking, I have a little over 11% of battery drain, but let's be clear on what I'm measuring here. In this particular case, my observation was to start writing and to keep writing until the end of the observation period. So I'm doing continuous writing on the screen. Furthermore, I was going into a lot of the menus to switch on pen styles and that sort of thing, and then obviously flipping over to new pages. So it was a very intensive note-taking. When you're actually using the note-taking app, when the app is active, but you're not writing on it, then it's not really using any energy at that point at all. So to do a test around continuous writing is slightly unusual, but it's the best way to kind of isolate what the impact of battery drain is while you're writing on the app. But just know if you're actually using note-taking, there's a lot of downtime between notes, and that would barely drain the battery at all. Finally, there's Reddit, and Reddit is kind of in between. It's a little bit less than Google News, so you are doing scrolling. You do have an occasional ad playing, but it's a lot more text-based. And as a result of that, we see lesser battery drain than Google News at 9.2%. Actually, there's one more, and this is for YouTube. And YouTube has what you would expect to see, which is a very heavy drain on the app, because that's including not only audio, but you're constantly refreshing the screen. I may have this statistic wrong, but it could be 12 frames per second, something like that. And so it's pretty intensive in terms of the battery drain, and the results make sense. In fact, if you look at all the apps, except for perhaps note-taking, I think it's pretty intuitive why the order is the way that it is. So given these drain percentages, it's a little bit easier now to kind of think through different scenarios and how battery life might differ with each. So we'll go to the first one, which is reading a novel and you're in a bright environment. So it requires no front lighting. You can turn all your connectivity off because once you download your novel, it's all there on the device. So what kind of battery life would you expect in that scenario? Well, remember with Kobo, the app drain was about 0.9% per hour, so pretty pithy. And then that results in an expected life of 108 hours. So that's pretty good. That's a lot of time. Now, this is not an unusual number, though, for reading a novel on an e-reader. In fact, a lot of e-readers excel at just reading text. I don't know the measurements of other e-readers as well as I do this device and the Tab Mini C, but I would imagine that most devices would be able to match or perhaps even exceed this amount. So I don't think this is necessarily notable for this type of activity, but it's still excellent battery life, just objectively speaking. So this is one extreme example. So another extreme example is you're playing YouTube and you're in a darkened environment. So you've got to use Wi-Fi because you need that connection. You're refreshing the screen as intensely as any particular app, and you're using that full front lighting as well. So this is a heavy battery drain example. And you can see all the elements there. And it basically results in a device that you'd have just under 4 hours of expected life if you were doing this activity for the entire time. So 4 hours versus a little over 100 is a massive range. And so you can see why people with their own experiences and their own combination of usage could come to different conclusions regarding the battery life. So let's take a look at what might be a more reasonable example that might more closely align with how people actually use the device. So in this particular example, we're going to be in a fairly well-lit environment. So you need some front lighting, but you don't have to go all the way. We just want to keep Wi-Fi on because it's convenient. We don't want to toggle that back and forth. And we're going to spend about a third of our time reading, a novel, a third of the time reading magazines, and maybe a third of the time doing note-taking. So if we look at those elements, the 2% Wi-Fi drain, the 1% light drain, and then the average of those three is about a 5% app drain, then we're talking about 12 and a half hours of expected life for the device in total. And I think this is probably closer to what most people will experience, obviously, than the other two extreme examples. So this represents a little more accurately what the life of the device might be for you. So hopefully that information kind of gave you a little bit of a guide as to what you can expect if you were to purchase the device. You kind of know what the average per hour drain is of different activities. And if you had a sense of how you're going to use the device, you can simply kind of look at that and make an estimate based on your expected usage of what the battery drain might end up being. So that's kind of the hope of being able to publish this information. Now, I'll add a few more points around battery drain. First off, around charge time. I was able to charge the device 75% of the way, and that took a little over 5 hours when it was plugged into the USB port of my computer. If you extrapolate that, that means you would go through a full charge in just under 7 hours. So that's a little bit of information there. What I'd like to do in charging my devices is I'll charge it before I go to bed. At night, I'll plug it in, and then I come in the morning, and enough time has passed that the device is fully charged, and then I'll disconnect it. This is how I've always charged my devices for years now, and it doesn't seem to have any negative impacts on the devices themselves. I haven't seen any battery degradation, or I haven't seen it, overheating or anything like that. In fact, I always feel the devices just to check to see how it's holding up. And when I come in the morning, it's room temperature. So that's one thing there. Another thing I'll point out is around standby time. I have not had an opportunity to measure standby time yet. I will do that in the coming days, and I will put those results into the notes section of this video, so you'll be able to come back to it later if you're interested. What I can tell you now, though, is that there is a benchmark here, which I think is a reasonable rule of thumb. The Tab Ultra C drained about 1% per day on standby mode, and then the Tab Mini C drained about 3% per day on standby mode. So I expect this device to be in that neighborhood, the 1 to 3% range per day, And again, I will do that measurement, and then I'll put this in here to let you know in the next few days. So, what does all this mean ultimately? Is the battery life of the 3C good or not? Well, here's kind of my gut feeling based on all this information. Obviously, the answer is it depends. And now you know what it depends on and how that might impact your usage of the device. But just speaking in very general terms, I do find that the device's battery tends to discharge quicker than other devices that I've worked with. It's not dramatic. If I compare this to the measurements that I made with the Tab Mini C, I think the Tab Mini C had a better battery life for these activities, but it wasn't by a large margin. So I do think ultimately that the size of the 3C's battery does work against its detriment. Obviously, the flip of that is it does reduce the weight of the device. So that's something. I'm sure that reduces the cost as well. So there are pros and cons to the size of the battery. And ultimately, while I do think that the 3C tends to be kind of on the weaker side in terms of battery drain, I don't find it unacceptable at all. As I've been doing these videos, I've only charged it once since I got the device a few days ago, and I've been using it quite a bit. So I've been pretty happy with the device, and the battery life maybe isn't the greatest, but I don't think it's particularly detrimental either. So there it is. I hope you found this helpful. It's a very complicated question, actually, and it is very personal to how you use the device. So hopefully I gave you information to be able to apply to your situation, how this is relevant. But if you have any questions, put them in the comments, and I'll try my best to answer them. Otherwise, have a great day.